Europe is returning to its true self, piratical, thieving, lawless, and utterly corrupt. A place where there is a massive gap in living standards between self-proclaimed aristocrats and the people, where the era of long wars is coming back, where human life counts for nothing, and where there is no value system at all. There isn't even any sense of elitism. There's nothing. It's an endless level of degradation.
Europe is the enemy, the one supposedly blocking peace and pushing war. And Ukraine, in Moscow's fantasy world, it should not exist as a country at all. Only under those conditions, they say, is peace even possible. Yes, that's what Kremlin propagandists are openly dreaming about. New week, new nonsense from Russia. I'm Sofia and this is Spin Snipers, where we turn Kremlin drama into quick reality checks. Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner have wrapped up their visit to Moscow. Another US delegation, and honestly I've lost count at this point, went to hear Putin's position on a possible peace plan. Because, maybe this time suddenly a miracle will happen and Putin will be ready to compromise. Yes, suddenly. Officially, there is very little information, no details on what even was discussed, no clarity on what Russia is supposedly ready to offer. Silence. Well, almost silence. Apart from continued large-scale strikes on Ukrainian civilian cities, Russia's real position is much easier to hear elsewhere, straight from the mouths of Kremlin propagandists, and they've been unusually honest.
In order to prevent Ukraine from building up the strength to resume resistance against us, a crucial part of the negotiations, of course, must involve restructuring Ukraine, determining a status that, to put it mildly, would be semi-sovereign, so that for at least the next couple of generations, the threat of Ukraine transforming into an anti-Russia state would not exist.
Kremlin propagandists are not even hiding it anymore. The real goal of these so-called peace talks is simple: the disappearance of Ukraine as a sovereign and independent state. And now, about this whole anti-Russian myth. Before 2014, Ukraine was not anti-Russian, not even close. That was the year Russian forces, or as the Russian dictator prefers to call them, polite people, launched their war against Ukraine. At the same time, Ukrainians were making a pro-European choice during the Maidan protests. Ukraine had a non-aligned, neutral status. Pro-Russian political parties regularly came to power, Ukrainian artists performed in Moscow, and Russia was not widely seen as an enemy by Ukrainian society. So, this idea of Ukraine as an anti-Russia, Moscow created itself through military aggression, occupation, and attempts to destroy Ukraine's sovereignty. Not because Ukraine chose West, but because Russia chose war.
Not everyone can establish their own state. Unfortunately, that's just how it is. Some nations simply fail to use that chance when history gives it to them. It happens.
Our task now is to shift the conversation to this very question: how these people who have failed the test of sovereignty are going to live from here on out.
Russia's demands? Spoiler alert, nothing has changed. They still claim they're protecting the so-called Russian-speaking population. So much, in fact, that the areas of Ukraine where Russian was mostly widely spoken, those are getting shelled the hardest. And of course, they are also protecting the Orthodox Church, a church that had been long packed with Kremlin loyalists, spreading propaganda and backing the war against Ukraine. Oh, and territory, neutrally, they want as much of it as possible. Basically, protect the language, protect the church, steal the land. Check, check, check.
Of course, we can't put this off. Ukraine needs a new constitution, new constitutional laws. We need to build a legal framework on which Ukraine can develop. Whatever remains of the country after this conflict must have guaranteed rights for Russian-speaking communities, protections for the Orthodox Church, and a neutral status, and perhaps, something similar to what China did in the 15th century, when the emperor decided that no one could approach the coast within 20 kilometers, declaring China a continental power. I think we should create a similar zone from Odessa to Kherson, so that Ukraine forgets the idea of ever being a maritime state.
Some of the Kremlin talking heads are even more honest. They openly say Ukraine should be divided, and of course the biggest piece goes to Russia. And here is the reality check. This is what Russia actually calls a peace plan. In their version of peace, Ukraine gives up territory, sovereignty, its right to decide its own future. So yeah, if you were looking for compromise, keep looking.
In Galicia, Volhynia, and Transcarpathia, people already know their constitutions. They've read the Polish and Hungarian constitutions. In Chernivtsi, they've studied the Romanian constitution in detail. That's the right trend. For everyone else, outside of these 7 regions, I would advise studying the Russian constitution. It would be very useful. For once, they wouldn't be stuck in the rear, but actually in the center of the historical process.
And here is the spin of the week. Russia is accusing Europe of wanting to start a war against Russia. Yes, you heard it right. Europe, the peacemakers, apparently the real warmongers. It's familiar and frankly very worrying trend. Before 2022, Moscow was already pushing this message, mostly directed at Kyiv. And then on February 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So if you're keeping score, blaming others while invading, that's the Kremlin version of responsible foreign policy.
We have no intention of going to war with Europe. I've said that 100 times. But if Europe suddenly decides it wants a war and starts one, we're ready right now. There can be no doubt about that. The question is this: if Europe does start a war with us, I think things would unfold very quickly. This isn't Ukraine. In Ukraine, we're acting with surgical precision, carefully. You understand, right? It's not a war in the full, modern sense of the word. But if Europe chooses to start a war against us, things could escalate so fast that there might be no one left for us to negotiate with.
Once again, Russia is supposedly acting carefully in Ukraine? You heard that? Carefully. Let's see, occupation of territories, shelling of civilian cities, torture of prisoners, kidnapping of Ukrainian children. Yep, that's what they call careful. And of course, the Russian dictator blames Europe not for the invasion, of course, but for starting a war and neutrally for spoiling peace negotiations. Reality check. If it's careful, I would hate to see what aggressive looks like.
Seeing that they don't like the outcome today either, they've started interfering with the current U.S. administration and President Trump in their efforts to reach peace through negotiation. They rejected peace talks themselves, and now they're trying to block President Trump from pursuing them as well.
It's brutally cynical to hear the Russian dictator talk about peace. A man whose hands are not just bloody from his own people, but especially from Ukrainians. And honestly, claiming that Europe is blocking negotiations just by trying to keep Ukraine as a sovereign state says a lot about Russia's position. Moscow is not looking for a frozen conflict line. Nope. Moscow wants all of Ukraine. Basta.
Third, they have no peace agenda. They're clearly on the side of war. And even when they try to pretend they're proposing adjustments to Trump's plan, we can see perfectly well that every one of those changes is aimed at just one thing: blocking the entire peace process. They're putting forward demands that are absolutely unacceptable for Russia, and they know it. And then they plan to blame Russia for the collapse of the peace process.
On Russian TV, the story is the same. Everything is Europe's fault. Europe does not support Russia's peace plan. They help Ukraine, and suddenly Russia is the victim. Even increasing European defense budget in response to ongoing Russian aggression is painted as a preparing for war. And here is a fun fact they never mention. In 2026, 40% of Russia's own budget will go to defense. But apparently, that's not worth talking about.
Europe, it has always been clear to us that it's a spoiler in this process. Europe isn't interested in peace. Today, some quite telling figures for the past year were released. Military production in Europe has risen by nearly 15%, and the total European arms market is 182 billion euros. Even if a third of that goes to exports, Europe is still buying even more. So every year, the amount of weaponry in Europe grows by this sum.
And if you are wondering what exactly would Europe gain from starting a war against Russia, don't worry, the talking heads have an answer. Apparently, it's all about saving the ruling elites. Oh really? Because I thought it worked the other way around. That it was Russia that started a war to keep Putin's inner circle in power for as long as it's possible. You know, silence dissent, crush opposition, rally society around a made-up external enemy. War is a survival strategy for the regime. But sure, let's blame Europe.
Today, the Russian president made it clear what will happen to them if they dare to make a move. Because for them, making that move is the only path they see to saving themselves. The only one. Foolhardiness and bravado. What they'll manage to prepare for, that's another question. And I'd rather not get into it. Time will tell. It's not that simple. But the fact that they now see a war with Russia as the only way to save Europe's ruling class, to me, that's absolutely obvious.
And here is a fun one. According to Russian logic, if Europe is even a little united, obviously that automatically turns into Russophobia. Yes, apparently standing together for peace, supporting Ukraine and defending international law equals hating Russia. Because, you know, criticizing an invasion is obviously offensive to the invader. Classic Kremlin logic.
We told them, if you want to act, and not like Europeans, because once again, European unity is just Russophobia. That's what European unity really is. Europe only unites for one purpose, to strike at Russia. Look at every European coalition, from Napoleon to Hitler, and the smaller ones in between. Europe comes together for only one reason, to wage war against Russia.
And of course, Moscow's idea of the ideal European politician, drumroll, none other than Viktor Orban. Yes, the man who loves to hop over to Moscow for a little audience with the Russian dictator and conventionally block any pro-Ukraine decisions along the way.
Macron is a representative of the global financial elite. He does not represent the interests of the French people. This is what unites the leadership of France and Germany. They are anti-national. They are unpatriotic. Everything they do worsens the situation in their countries. They do not act in the interests of their people. They don't care. Meanwhile, Orban acts in the interests of his people. Honor and glory to him.
So now France and Germany's leadership is apparently anti-patriotic? Really? Because I thought that title went to Russia. You know, the only true patriots capable of turning their country into the world's black sheep and becoming the most sanctioned nation on earth. Only Moscow could call this patriotism. And here we go again. Moscow is already threatening that Washington and Moscow alone will decide Europe's fate. At this point, the Russian talking heads seem so carried away, even the US looks a bit uncertain in their imaginary scenario.
Yes, Russia and the United States are discussing everything without Europe, and decisions will be made without Europe. It's even possible that Europe's fate will be decided without it. Russia and the United States. That's a very real prospect. Well, if the United States survives the cataclysm that awaits it, and that's an open question as well.
That's it for today. While the Russian propaganda machine keeps running, we'll keep exposing their lies. I'm Sofia, and this was Spin Snipers. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and don't fall for the spin.